Do you know God? Not rhetorical. Do you know God? Yes? Unsure? What do you know? He's good? Well read. He's good. What do you know? Compassionate? He loves you? He has a sense of humor? Absolutely. He created me, clearly. Yeah. He's sovereign, even though it doesn't feel like it sometimes. Yeah, but he's sovereign. What else do you know? He's faithful. Yeah, we did a whole 3 weeks on that, so that's a good one. Say that again. He's merciful. It's very good. Here's an interesting question to consider. All those things that have been shouted out, and if you're watching what you may have considered, how is that knowledge of God shaping your spiritual experience of God? This is from the book, The Good and Beautiful God, by James Bryan Smith. Here's what they say. Our thoughts about God will determine not only who we are, but how we live. We can predict the spiritual future of a person just by knowing what they think about God. Consider that for a moment. Your spiritual future with God and with others is shaped by what you think about God. If your sense of God is that is capricious or unknowing or mysterious or scary, that might shape how you approach him in prayer, in service, or in attitude. If he's loving or faithful or sovereign, it shapes how we approach him. That thought is the very essence of this book, The Good and Beautiful God, that this message series is loosely based on. That book, actually, we're recommending for all of our faith group leaders as a potential study in your faith groups in the coming fall. For those of you who don't know what a faith group is, small group of people who gather together to get to know one another, to get to know the Bible, and put what they've learned into practice. And this book introduces you to ideas and concepts about God that some people may not know, but certainly trying to expand your experience of who God is and how you encounter him. We think about God in many different ways, but if how we think about him shapes our spiritual experience and our spiritual future, it's important for us to sometimes take a moment and pause and go, what do we know and how do we know God? And that word know is pretty critical in unpacking that sentence. Because we know things about God, intellectual knowledge, but what the Bible wants us to do is know God from an intimate, personal experience with him. Not just, I know something that I was taught, but also I have experienced him and encountered him in a personal way that now the stories that I've read about him become my story with him. Does that make sense? That traction? That's what we want to try to unpack. So I'm assuming you're here because you have questions about God, or you have questions about your spiritual experiences with God. You're searching maybe for something a little deeper. You desire to learn more about God and to have an experience with him. You have a desire for deeper and richer spiritual experiences. I'm assuming you want a deep, rich, and meaningful spiritual future with God and others. Or at least you're exploring that. The way to that is to know God. And the more you know God, the deeper your spiritual experience will be. So how do I get to know God? I'm going to unpack that just very quickly, and then I'm going to provide an experience at the end for us to step into that concept of knowing. Because the essence of that word know really comes from a number of biblical terms, but the idea is about knowing somebody in a personal, intimate, connected way, not just learning information about someone. And so how do you get to know God? Well, obviously, the first way is with your head. And I don't mean banging your head against the Bible. You get to know God with your head. Think about Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, I urge you, Paul writes to the people in Rome, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, what you think about God, I urge you to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Renewing of your mind, with your head, with your mind, coming to God and going, what I think about God, then I have an experience with him, and I reshape how I think about God based on my experiences with him. And so much of what we have to do, unfortunately, is unlearn what we learned as children about God, because sometimes what we learned wasn't correct. Maybe it's a parent trying to use God in some way to scare you. Well, God's going to get you. Fortunately, churches have done that for a long time. We have to unlearn that. There's been this teaching floating around for centuries that God hates you, that God is angry with you, that God wants to punish you, and the Father is out to get you. And if Jesus wasn't in the way, he would get you. But thank Jesus that Jesus stepped in the way of God's wrath and kind of took it all away from us. Do you see how that image of God shapes him to be this horrible person chasing you down, and Jesus kind of, like the older brother, wards the father off? That was part of the teaching of the church for centuries. There's this idea of renewing our mind when we understand that the Father is not out to get you. The Father created you, wants a relationship with you, and we run away. So he chases and sends his Son to woo us back. Renewing our mind is an idea of, as we learn more about God, to change our thinking and reshape that thinking. So yes, how do you get to know God? With your head. Think about learning language. I grew up in South Africa, so we were taught two of the now 11 national languages in South Africa. They were mandated teaching. So I learned Afrikaans and English. And because I was an English speaker, Afrikaans was just something I learned, but everybody's talking around you. So at some point, you stop translating in your head. You begin to speak Afrikaans as though it was part of who you are. Now, I moved to the States, and I no longer do that. Now in my head, I have to translate into Afrikaans when I'm trying to communicate in Afrikaans. And all of you can speak Afrikaans, okay? Say this phrase for me. Buy a donkey. Okay, now you're thinking about buying an animal. But in Afrikaans, you just said thank you. Buy a donkey is the word thank you in Afrikaans. Buy a donkey. But in my mind, I have to translate, thank you, buy a donkey. But if I knew the language, I wouldn't translate in my head. I wouldn't have to go through that head moment. How many of you speak more than one language or are learning more than one? You have an understanding of what I'm talking about, right? When you begin to know the language as though it was your own. That's what we're trying to talk about. How do I get to know God? So you start with your head, but at some point it has to move to your heart. It has to be something that is personal, intimate with who you are. And you've heard Pastor Laurel talk about how this is this 18-inch journey is the longest and hardest journey in your life, to move from what you know about God to knowing God. And so that's why the Israelites painted that picture for the Israelites as a great commandment in Deuteronomy 6, the Shema. Hear, O Lord, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. In Hebrew, that is not about emotions. The word heart here isn't about feeling in love with God. The word heart in Hebrew means the center of your being, the place where your emotions, your conscious decisions, your will, your attitude, your character finds a central core. That is your heart. Because believe it or not, when these words were written, you know where people thought your emotions came from? Your liver. It's very romantic, right? I love you with all my liver. It's like gross. The heart wasn't where they considered emotion to come from. It was your will, the center of your being, the real core of who you are. And so to love the Lord your God with all your heart was about all of who you are. In case you missed it, with all your soul and all your strength. And some later translations have with all your mind. So we want to love God. How do you get to know God? With your head, learning about Him. With your heart, having experiences, personal experiences with Him. Another way you get to know God is through Jesus. That sounds like the church answer, right? Jesus, obviously. But here's why. This is what Paul writes, Colossians 1:15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. When we look at Jesus, we get an image of the invisible God through Him. What do you see in Jesus as you look at Him? What reflection of the God who is invisible do you see through the Jesus you experience? If you want to know God, get to know Jesus better. It's why when people starting in the gospel, in their faith, ask me, where should I start reading in the Bible? I typically say start with the book of Mark. Gives you a brief kind of Cliff Notes introduction to Jesus. Then I encourage people, go and read Luke to unpack that a little bit more. Then go read Acts to see how the Spirit of Jesus impacts the churches. And then start reading the letters. So that's how I kind of guide people through that. I decided to take my own advice earlier on this year and changed up how I was reading the Bible and started listening to the Bible because that's how most people encountered the Bible. They didn't get it by reading it. They heard it by listening to it. These letters would be passed around in the churches and read to them. And so using the audio version of Bible app in my drive, I started to listen to the Gospel of Mark and then moved to Luke and Acts. And it was amazing how I just began to see things I hadn't seen before because I was hearing 3 or 4 chapters at a time rather than reading 2 verses at a time. Just started falling in love with Jesus again and who He was and what He was portraying. So through Jesus, we get to know God. Of course, you get to know God through other people. For some of you, this seems like Christianity 101. Good. We're starting a ministry year to remind ourselves what we're about. The way you experience Jesus, the way you experience God as you share that with me, helps me understand God from your perspective, helps me understand the Jesus you're encountering. It's why we want to encourage people to share their experiences. It's why in the Bible, Christianity and your faith with God is not a personal thing that is just between you and God. It's a communal thing between you, God, and other people you interact with. Which is why the writer of Hebrews says to the Hebrews he's writing to, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for He who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. And all the more as you see the day approaching. The day they're talking about is the return of Jesus. But the encouragement to the early church at that point was keep interacting with each other. Keep meeting together in your homes, in your communities, in your services. Keep meeting together to encourage one another in your faith, to encourage one another toward love of God, love of others. So we get to know God through other people. If you follow those 4 things, getting to know God with your head, with your heart, through Jesus and through others, you're going to encounter something amazing, that every experience you have becomes an opportunity to get to know God. This is called a journey of awakening. When people first become a Christian, they view getting to know God as something they do on a Sunday in a service or in their quiet time when they read the Bible. But as you mature in your faith, as you begin to understand that I get to know God through my own head interaction with the Bible, through my heart interacting with God, through my interactions with other people, as I get to know Jesus, people begin to learn that every opportunity is an opportunity to get to know God and grow in that experience. A monk once wrote about this. His name is Brother Lawrence. And he wrote a little book called Practicing the Presence of God. And he found a way to practice the presence of God, so much so that washing dishes became a spiritual experience for him. I'd like him to come to my house. He wrote in his letters to other people about how spending time talking with God, and by the way, just so we're clear, he didn't like washing dishes. He hated managing the kitchen. So he used it as an opportunity to talk to God. And he began to do what he called practicing the presence of God, which was to talk to God about what was going on inside of him as he was washing the dishes, talk to God about his experiences, and as God spoke to him, as thoughts came to his head, he presented those back to God. And he, at one point, wrote that he would have such powerful, moving experiences, he was brought to his knees in the kitchen. In fact, he used to find the regular rhythm of prayer that the monastery imposed on the monks, their rituals of morning prayer, lunchtime prayer, and evening prayer. He found that sometimes those interrupted his personal experiences with God. But he went and did them anyway. And then he got moved. He got moved to be in charge of the grocery buying. And he was a terrible negotiator. He didn't know how to negotiate good prices. But he did it willingly, and he began to practice the presence of God in that space as well. You can read about it in a short little book called Practicing the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. They're translations of his writings and his journals. But he talks about this idea that I go into a journey where my soul is awakened to the fact that God is present in everything I do. Would you like to have that sort of experience with God? Well, then you need to understand something about the good and beautiful God, that getting to know him, there are stages. Now, on your tables, and if you're watching online, you can kind of zoom in on this. There's a little handout from our group life team, and they have their offerings for this year, and they're based on this stage of spiritual growth, or what we call the critical journey. There are 6 stages. Now, on this side of the card where there's these white strips, these are the faith group life offerings for different stages. I'm going to come back to that for a moment. Just for now, look at this part of the card. It's on the other side, where they describe the 6 stages of spiritual growth. And I've spoken about this here before, but there's this journey of, in stage 1, you're searching for God. You've learned about him. You're curious about him, so you want to go and find out who he is. And this stage is marked by a discovery and growing awareness of God's purpose for our lives, and we seek to learn and grow. This is kind of head knowledge. I want to get to know God. I become aware of him, so I'm going to dive in a little deeper. And then as you get to know God a little more, you kind of move to stage 2, where you become this disciple of God. You learn and you put into practice what you're learning. You feel secure in your faith. You begin to share your faith with other people. Sometimes the stage is marked with arguing with others about how much you know. But this is the life of discipleship. And as you do those 2, what you begin to see happen in your life is this stage 3, the productive life, where you start seeing the fruits of your work. You start seeing the characteristics of God develop within you. You start seeing the Holy Spirit making a difference in you. You use your gifts to serve other people. Now, take for a moment on the card, just cover stages 4, 5, and 6. For many people, that's as far as they went, because that feels pretty good. I'm at the productive life. I'm at this place where I can go deep with God. And then something happens to a person. It could be a terminal illness, a disaster, an experience in their life that they can't make sense of, a prayer that goes unanswered the way they expect, an illness that they can't get rid of, a doubt that creeps into their mind that they can't quite get around or get an answer to. And what happens is this experience doesn't fit everything you've learned up to this point. This critical journey, based on the book, The Critical Journey, they call this the wall. and it's actually stage 4 in your growth with God. St. John of Anselm spoke about this as the dark night of the soul. It's an experience where you pray, but you feel like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling and not going anywhere. You begin to question, is the God I'm worshiping real? You begin to wonder if what you've learned about God is right. Things just don't seem to work. I've had this experience multiple times. And this is something important to know about these stages of growth. They're not one time and they're not linear. You can move through them and you can have a wall multiple times in your life. For me, this wall, as I said, it happened multiple times, but for one of the occasions was when I was powerfully aware of a sin in my own life, and I couldn't get around it, couldn't solve it, couldn't fix it. I'd asked God for forgiveness. I know that He had forgiven me, but I just didn't experience it or feel it. And I had to come to some level of resolution that the sin in my life wasn't something external. It wasn't something I did. It was who I was. And God wanted to work on who I was, not just eradicate an action, but change bring an internal transformation. We talk about this as differentiation, being curious and close to God, but being fully aware of who you are, your failures, your successes, taking off that mask in front of God. That's stage 4, where you encounter a wall and you begin to journey inward and unpack a little bit about who you are. It's a challenging season. It's a hard season. And it's a season that every follower of Christ, if they want that deep, intimate, personal relationship with God that we're after, you have to go through the wall. Then stage 5 is this journey outward where you begin to surrender to God. You become aware of, this is who I am, and you don't feel like justifying it you're marked by people saying things like, I'm a sinner. You know who gets this right? People in recovery. Hi, my name is, and I am. There's an acknowledgement of who they are and the recovery they're in, not an explanation of it's because of them, it's because of something else outside of me, it's just who I am. It's a powerful place to be, to surrender to God and come out with a fresh focus and a new, renewed sense of purpose about who you are and how you're operating. And then stage 6, they call the life of love, where because you're aware of how sinful you are, that it's not something external, it's who you are, it's marked by humility, a desire to care for others, give up of yourself, surrender of who you are, and have compassion on people around you, where you begin to reflect God in a new and beautiful way. People at stage 5 and 6 begin to encounter a God who is good and beautiful and loving. He's not chasing you down. He's not trying to punish you. The Father is not angry with you. Instead, you encounter a Father who wants to be with you and you want to be with Him. And you realize He welcomes you in as you are, and then He can work on you and change you and transform you. That happens in stage 5 and 6. Here's something scary that happens in churches. The stage 1, 2, and 3 people think the stage 4, 5, and 6 people have lost the plot. Because they start saying things like, I serve in church because I want to serve, not because it does anything good for me. And they look at you like you have 5 heads. And the stage 4, 5, and 6 people think the stage 1, 2, and 3 people haven't quite got there yet. And so it's a great opportunity for the enemy to cause a little rift in the church. Instead, what we need to understand is that we're all on a journey. So I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself this question. Where are you currently in your journey with God? And what do you need to do in that space and in that stage? That's where this side of the card is helpful. Because our group life team has worked hard to provide opportunities for you regardless of what stage you're in. So if you're in that searching stage, wanting to get to know more about God, we've got these exploratory groups like Starting Point. We've got community groups where you get to know other people and can go a little deeper. We've got our ongoing faith groups where depending on the faith group you join, they can help you through any stage and any step of the stage. We've got... sorry, my eyes aren't working with me. Can I just read your card for a moment? No, not your glasses. The card. Thank you. Oh, my word, I'm getting old. We'll have short-term faith groups that can help people through, like The Wall, like grief share groups, topical groups that will help you dive into struggling situations. We have a host of digital resources that you can access through YouTube, through Right Now Media. And then what is exciting in our church for probably one of the first times ever in the history of our church, we're beginning to offer spiritual direction in groups and one-on-one that you can take, and also launching a group that will help you dive into Ignatian spiritual practices to start enjoying this later growth. And if you want to learn more about what that is, Karen, can I come talk with you? Go and talk with Karen. She can help you get connected with groups at any of these stages, but she's gone through the Ignatian spiritual practices. Karen, for those of you who don't know, is a spiritual director, so she can talk to you about those later stages. If you've been coming to church for a long time and are going, I wish there was something more, there is. This is it. And if you're feeling like your relationship with God has flagged a little and is draining a little, here's a way to ignite it, to renew it, to go deeper with it. It's a wonderful opportunity that I'd like to encourage you to do. So what are some next steps you can do in pursuing your relationship with God? Well, use this card. Go home, pray it through this week, look at those opportunities, get a sense of where do you think you are in your journey, and start reaching out to get the help you want.